Welcome everyone to our final webinar in our series, What About Privacy and Progress in Whole Genome Sequencing? This is Sharon Terry. I'm President and CEO of Genetic Alliance. We began this webinar series in January, and we're finishing it up here in December. And while most of the year we've gone through the various chapters and recommendations that the report itself laid out, we wanted to really branch out in this webinar. A couple of logistical issues, and then I'll get to the content of today's webinar. We're really grateful that we're seeing about 60 people on the webinar out of the couple hundred that signed up. As some of you know, on the East Coast, we're having a snowstorm, which is bigger for some people than others, and the federal government and all the schools are closed. So we're grateful for those of you who are venturing onto this webinar from home, and then of course we welcome all the rest of you from the rest of the country where maybe your weather is a little nicer than here today. We have you all muted. We do that because with such a large number of people, it's too hard to have you ask questions in a way that makes sense to us and to the speakers. And so what we ask is during this webinar, you'll see a control panel that GoToWebinar puts up. There's a place for you to put questions in a little box, and you can type those in at any time. Sometimes your question gets answered as the speaker continues. It's actually a good sociological experiment for what happens when people talk and people want to ask questions. And then often the question is not answered. And so what we do, the Genetic Alliance staff does, is look at how do we put those questions together in a way that makes sense so that the like questions are put together easily. This webinar and all of our webinars are recorded. All of them are available on our website, geneticalliance.org/webinar. Our website is brand new as of a couple days ago, so certainly let us know if you see any glitches along the way. Anywhere on the website, we're happy to have those glitches reported to us so we can fix them. And so the webinar and the slides will be available on the website shortly after, as soon as we can get through editing it and getting it up. Again, feel free to ask questions at any time. We'll take care of those. And if there are logistical questions, I can take care of those while the speakers are talking as well. What we're going to have our speakers do is to each give a presentation between 15 and 20 minutes or so. And that'll leave us about 20 minutes at the end to have a conversation about this. We're going to ask them if they want to converse with each other in any way to clarify things that they each said, and then I will present the questions to them so that they can answer them. You may ask either one or both of them. So today's webinar is Ancestry and Whole Genome Sequencing, Other Privacy Concerns. And so we are looking certainly at the report that the Presidential Commission gave us, but in addition, we're branching out a little here to say that report needs to live in the real world. There are already ways that the public interacts with their genome, and a good way, a good place for us to look is Ancestry. Our two speakers today are Jennifer Wagner, who's an attorney and anthropologist at the University of Pennsylvania, and Ken Chahine, who's a senior vice president and general manager of DNA at Ancestry.com. We're going to have Jen go first, and then Ken, and then we will take questions. But as I said, feel free to type them at any point. Jen, as soon as your slides are up here, and we would love for you to go forward.
Okay, great. All right. So thank you for inviting me to be part of this webinar. It's a topic that I think about quite frequently. I am an ancestry testing consumer myself. But I also have done anthropological research in this area for a few years now. So what I'd like to do today is just to briefly go over some aspects of ancestry testing. Then I'll discuss privacy and confidentiality and a little bit of overview on the legal perspective of privacy rights that the Privacy in Progress report had covered as well. And then we'll talk more about ancestry testing and the privacy interests that are involved, and ask the question, really, are we concerned about privacy, or are there other interests that we're actually trying to pursue in these areas? So we all are members of the same species, right? So this implies necessarily that we're all related to one another to varying degrees. The question becomes, how far back in time do we need to look to find our most recent common ancestor when we're thinking about two individuals who are on the planet today? And we can think about ancestry in a number of different ways. For some of us, and I'm drawing this information from the Ancestry white paper that Charmaine Royal and colleagues had put out just a few years ago. But we're conceptualizing ancestry, for example, in terms of continents, continental origins, biogeographical ancestry, if we're thinking about countries of origin and the like. But we're also thinking about lineages and descent groups and families. And because of that, we need to consider the sociopolitical rules that have been applied in determining membership to those descent groups and lineages. Those could be unilineal or ambilineal and even bilateral descent, and those aren't consistent from one culture to the next or one society to the next. And we also can think about hypo-descent rules and hyper-descent rules. Our conceptualizations of kinship and relatedness are multifaceted, and they're really context specific. So anthropologists might trace recognized relationships to an ego. Genealogists trace relationships to a subject or a particular individual, and clinicians would call that individual a proband. Okay, as Reed Pieritz has stated a number of times, family medical history and family trees, that was the first genetic test, and it remains useful today. So tracing genealogies and pedigrees have very real and important psychosocial meanings and legal meanings, completely separate from any kind of clinical utility when we're thinking about DNA analyses and what we do in the medical setting. When we talk about DNA ancestry, it may reflect those expected levels of sharing that are inferred from other sources, but it might raise unexpected or provide surprising results. So motivations for tracing relationships are distinct, and the information that we collect given those motivations is similarly nuanced and specific. So those expectations that an individual brings to the testing process will affect the ability to have consumer acceptance, satisfaction, and a willingness to engage with those results. And this raises a lot of questions in terms of the method in which the results are communicated, the context in which that information is communicated and received, and the point in time developmentally from a psychological standpoint at which the individual receives that information and encounters it. It will make a difference in the understanding and the attitudes that the individual has in regards to the test. So in the United States, we've had these social political rules that have restricted not just an individual's ability to shape or self-ascribe identity, but it also has influenced the way in which we engage in marriages and mate and the like. And so we've had these hypo-descent and hyper-descent rules. So the use of these kind of subordinate and dominant terms inherently suggests a superiority of one group over another. And in the case of the United States, that has been the group that were referred to as white or Caucasian or European American. So hypo-descent rules were applied to African Americans in terms of the one-drop rule, and really hyper-descent rules were seemingly applied to Native Americans in terms of having a certain blood quantum. And if you want kind of child-friendly way to start talking about these issues, you can just look at Harry Potter, and the mudblood is the term that's used to talk about Hermione Granger, and it is used in a derogatory way, but it was to talk about the fact that this character, she's quote unquote muggle-born. She doesn't have any wizard parents, and so that's a kind of a fictional version of what we're talking about here. But in the United States, the situation was different in a nuanced way than, say, in Brazil or South Africa or another country. But what has happened is that these social rules, these political rules, have prevented marriages and have actually helped shape the ancestry. They've shaped the biological and the underlying genetic variation that we would see if we would look at individuals from any particular social group. The images and the messages that are used along with DNA ancestry testing results may be sources of tension for proponents and opponents of this type of technology, particularly when we talk about how ancestry is a factor that helps mold these cultural identities. So origin, for example, can have many different meanings to different individuals, and some of these definitions may be considered personal or sensitive, while others may not. So this becomes relevant when we're trying to grapple with the boundaries of privacy rights. One thing that I want to remind us of is this distinction between privacy and confidentiality. Privacy relates to a person and controlling access to oneself, controlling what is projected to the outside world, while confidentiality refers to the treatment of data or information shared from one person to another within a particular setting or a fiduciary relationship. So you can think of the physician-patient relationship. And in terms of that information will not be disclosed outside of that relationship unless there's express authorization to do so. Now, the direct-to-consumer companies establish their own privacy policies and develop the technological capabilities to facilitate the flow of information. And so when we're thinking about privacy, sometimes we're thinking about the access to information that someone has. So we're thinking between consumers, right? What one consumer can see versus what another consumer can see about that same individual, but also beyond that. So it's not just how the information is accessible from one user to another, but also from the test taker to the test provider. So what is the test provider actually seeing or accessing in terms of information? When the direct-to-consumer companies hit the market years ago, there were many questions about what happens to the data if the companies go belly up. So would these databases be sold or transferred to a third party with whom the individual consumer has never agreed to share such information? And hopefully Ken will be able to address this issue perhaps either in his presentation or in the question and answer period. If we look at the Privacy in Progress report that the Bioethics Commission had put out, they did provide an overview of how privacy is protected or conceptualized in the United States generally, and I just wanted to refresh our memories about that. So the legal recognition of privacy rights really goes back to this 1890 journal article that Warren and Brandeis had written. And while we've had 120 years of maturation of this concept, there really isn't a universally accepted definition of privacy. We can look to the Constitution for different bases of protecting privacy, such as freedom of expression and association found in the First Amendment. But one thing that's important to keep in mind is what gave rise to this need for a legal recognition of this right. And it was instant photography, really. The idea that you didn't have to sit for your portrait to be taken. Someone could take your photo and then publish it. So yellow journalism and photography really were the impetus for the writing of this article. And I think that's important for us to keep in mind when we're thinking about the challenges of the internet, the informational movement, and the ability of people to capture information about others and broadcast that quickly and across great distances. There are 4 different realms of privacy, so to speak. So informational privacy are the concerns about access to personal information, both in terms of quality and quantity. So we might not care if someone knows something about us generally, but we might feel violated if someone knows intimate details. Physical privacy is regarding access to persons and personal spaces. Decisional privacy would relate to concerns about personal choices without interference by governmental entities or others. And propriety privacy, which is concerns about ownership interest in human personality. And then the civil complaints that we have, or the means to address problems, relate to how the information has been obtained and then subsequently what is done with that information. Now, I think this may have come up in previous webinar sessions with regard to the informed consent issues. Surreptitious testing is the idea of testing someone's DNA without their knowledge or consent. And certainly this has been raised with regard to direct-to-consumer testing. So who is actually sending in the sample to get it analyzed? This kind of practice has been banned in the UK since 2006, but it's not not necessarily prohibited in the US yet. So there's no specifically recognized federal right to genetic privacy in the US. But if we look at the states, and again, this image is coming right from the Privacy in Progress report. If we look at the states, we can see that there's variability, but there are a few states who do prohibit this type of surreptitious testing, like New York or Florida. And similarly, there are a few states that just prohibit direct-to-consumer testing at large. Now, this map shows the wide range of variability across the states and how they address specifically genetic issues, but I want to remind us that similarly, we could look at a map and see variability in accessibility of genealogical information generally. So in terms of, can you access vital records like birth certificates and death certificates to learn genealogical information, that's going to vary. The process will vary, and the extent of information that you have access to will vary from state to state. In the United States, we do protect our genetic information in a patchwork of ways. So while there's no specific federal law on genetic privacy, there are a number of other laws in effect, and generally applicable laws that would apply. And these would include Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, the Clinical Laboratory Improvements Amendments Act, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and even the Federal Trade Commission Act. And as the Commission also highlighted in their report, in the US, the privacy interests are really protected under context-specific statutes. So we don't protect all information all the time. We do it in a specific way in specific settings. Ancestry testing causes us to think about who is really involved in the consideration of privacy, whose privacy interests are at stake. And with ancestry testing, perhaps even more so than the health-related kind of analysis, the privacy concerns are not limited to the test taker. The non-test takers, the family members, the members of the same community and ethnic groups, have privacy interests that are affected by a single or a group of individuals' participation in this type of testing. And that's simply because an individual's participation unavoidably, though perhaps unintentionally, shares information about other individuals in probabilistic ways. And really what an informed consent is, in many regards, is a waiver of privacy. And so if we're thinking about informed consent and these privacy issues in terms of other individuals, the question becomes, what consent is sufficient? How much consent do we need, and from whom? So do we need not only the individual's consent, but the individual's family members, or the individual's community, or what have you? And if we're talking about a collective entity, the question becomes, do we need a consensus? Do we need just a majority to provide consent? Or is there some sort of representative that would be recognized to be able to speak and provide consent for any particular individual? So the question really becomes how we draw an appropriate line, balancing individual autonomy with the probabilistic information that may implicate another's interest in privacy. Okay, if we look at which individuals would provide the informed consent, this raises a lot of questions. And some of the states that are trying to grapple with genetic rights laws, they're trying to fall back on property interests, but I'm not going to talk about that today, just to keep moving forward. My research in this area of DNA ancestry testing has found, indeed, there's a lot of sharing going on. I mean, that's one of the key elements and exciting draws to companies like 23andMe and others, is this idea that consumers will be able to make additional connections. So if we look at Facebook, there are plenty of Facebook groups that are devoted specifically to particular haplogroups. And some of these are open, meaning anyone can see who's in the group and anyone can join the group. Some of them are closed, meaning that you need some kind of approval to get into the group, or that it's presumably protecting some of the privacy of the individuals that are there. But they're sharing this information. Some of them are posting their results on the walls and what have you. And so we can look to consumers' use of blogs and chat rooms, Twitter feeds, and even the social networking capabilities of the test providing companies themselves. And also, most of the users that, as far as my research was concerned, most of the users were actually participating in more than one test and more than one company. Okay. Now I want to just draw your attention to this idea of genetic exceptionalism. So the interest of the root seeker to access information may be in conflict with privacy interests of those sought. But this isn't really much different from the sources of information that we look to in genealogy generally, right? So we could have informants, vital records, often, death certificates could reveal medical information, the cause of death, and what have you. We have public information, and so with the ability to share information and family trees widely and rapidly, genealogists who are getting involved with DNA ancestry testing are questioning how to do this activity responsibly. Okay. And what you can see from this top right image is a genome-wide comparison, a chromosome painting from 23andMe, and it shows my genome versus my sister's. And it highlights how every time I personally participate in research or in DNA ancestry testing, I'm sharing information about my sister with the researchers, even when she might be unaware or might not approve of it. But this reminds us that that's not going to be the same for every testing company, for every test, or for every individual. So each locus in the genome has its own evolutionary past. So the type of information that we're potentially revealing about others will be different from test to test. And also the potential people who are implicated in those tests are going to be different from test to test. And what I want to get to at the end of my talk here is just to discuss other interests that we may have. So we might be interested in protecting privacy in terms of preventing other harms, whether that's exploitation, stigmatization, discrimination, and the like. For example, protecting privacy of certain information may be used as a way to prevent misuse of that information for discriminatory purposes. The first genetic non-discrimination laws themselves were passed in the 1970s because employers were using sickle cell trait status as a pretext to discriminate against African Americans. And conducting genetic research studies using one tribe or one community, for example, could lead to stigmatization if risk alleles or predispositions are found for conditions like depression or alcoholism or criminal behavior and other types of traits and attributes that we tend to frown upon from a societal standpoint. So there are numerous concerns with ancestry testing and its implications on racial and ethnic identity. Kim Tallbear, for example, has articulated potential problems that stem from narratives that imply we are all African, as opposed to highlighting our shared common ancestry, and also narratives implying that they're the vanishing indigene. So these conceptualizations could cause cultural harms by allowing the effects of the slave trade to persist and by implying that indigenous peoples need saving or protecting by someone else. However, providers and users of the tests emphasize self-empowerment and the ability to recover information and learn new information about one's ancestry that they would otherwise not have been able to access. My research had found that users experience increased sense of affiliation with groups that show up in their DNA ancestry test results, but they do not concurrently experience a sense of separation from the other groups. The users are interested in getting additional information. They seek to learn more about the cultures and the history and the geography associated with the ancestry indicated by their DNA ancestry results. So there are just two important concepts that I think are worth noting, and those are these ideas of objective self-fashioning and affiliative self-fashioning. So the first was used in regards to how scientific information or biological medical information is received and how that's conceptualized. So Joseph Dumit had talked about this concept as an ongoing process of social accounting to oneself and others in particular situations to which received facts function as particularly powerful resources because they bear the objective authority of science. And Alondra Nelson had extended this concept to the DNA ancestry setting and coined this term affiliative self-fashioning, and I'm going to quote her here. She said, quote, "Root seekers align bios, meaning life, and bios, life narratives, life histories, in ways that are meaningful to them. These users of genetic genealogy interpret and employ their test results in the context of personal experience and the historically shaped politics of identity. They actively draw together and evaluate many sources of genealogical information, genetic and otherwise, and from these weave their own ancestry narratives, close quote. And so what we really are thinking about when we're thinking about privacy concerns is the ability to have self-determination and prevent reification of racial stereotypes. Some people have talked about ethno-stress and ethnic options and ethnic fraud. And most recently, Sandra Lee had talked about this double entendre of recreation and recreation. And so when we think about DNA ancestry testing, it may be much more serious for some individuals than such terms would imply. So I'm gonna end here, but I just wanted to end by saying the privacy interests are relative, and they're often competing with other interests. They're variable. There's inter and intra-individual variability. So privacy information at one point in time for one individual may be different than at another time. And there are different interests in this type of testing, for example, missing persons or trafficked persons, and also adoptees and children of assisted reproductive technologies who might want this information to complement vital records and the like. The socio-technical architecture affects the experiences, the attitudes, and the awareness. So what you get, how you interact with the company and your information is going to make a difference. And I think Ken will be able to provide his company's perspective on this and what they do to help individuals in terms of aligning expectations with what the test can do and finding a way to work with that information. And then finally, in shaping our genetic rights, it's important for us to consider policies not only focused on privacy per se, but also the other interests that go along with that, such as non-discrimination and equality. And then finally, I just have some suggested reading, some of the papers that I mentioned during my talk, and I believe these slides will be made available. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Jen. That was really terrific overview. Thanks also, because we were constraining this to the report and to the privacy issues, we know that there are much bigger realms, and we're really happy that you touched on them as well. And we're happy, actually, in individuals' questions, feel free to go range wide and far. This is, again, the final webinar of the series, and we're really looking for lots of richness here, which may, in fact, even help entities like the Presidential Commission to consider their next forays. So without further ado, Ken, we'd love to hear from you.
Great. Well, obviously, want to really thank Genetic Alliance, for the opportunity to present. And I think we, in this, 15, 20 minutes, I try to focus on one aspect that we worked very hard with respect to ancestry testing, and that's really conveying to customers what it is that we're telling them and what it is that we're not telling them, and a sense that this is really a probabilistic, a lot of the analysis as we'll go in is really probabilistic, and to make sure that people realize that these things have an opportunity to change over time as we learn more. So I'm going to focus a little bit on that, and again, I'm happy to answer questions well beyond this at the end. So this is just our homepage. I mean, genetic testing the price has dropped dramatically. We all know that. And we're seeing really an acceleration of the sale of direct-to-consumer testing, certainly for genealogical reasons. I could say this year is going to be a much stronger year than last year, and we're ending the year very strong. So we're seeing, again, some momentum here at these price points where people are really interested in learning more about themselves. And this just gives you a sense of like what the growth of the database has been, and we're basically over 200,000 now samples that have been genotyped. We've actually sold a lot more than that, and you can see the database is just continuing to grow rapidly, and so the interest is there. And so our struggle is, how do we communicate genetics and science to everyone? And we see this not just from the perspective of Ancestry. We think that Ancestry has a really important role in teaching us how to communicate genetics and science, because there's so many parallels to some of the medical genetics that need to be communicated as well. But obviously the risk here is far less than any medical indication. So I'm going to just, there's two things that you get when you buy the test. The first one is we give you what we consider, or we call your genetic ethnicity, and I'll get into that in a second. And the second thing is that we compare compare your DNA to every other individual in the database. And so, as Jen was saying, we're all related, and if you saw the data, you would believe that, because we're seeing an incredible number of matches at sort of that third and fourth cousin level, where you tend to have, hundreds, if not thousands, of cousins. But I'm going to focus, primarily, given the time constraints, on sort of the admixture or the genetic ethnicity, and kind of what we've done from our beta version to our version V2 in terms of communicating that information. So just to take a step back, what we call the global ethnicity, we currently have a lot of different regions. I think it's 26 regions across the globe. With this new update, we actually further broke down Europe into a couple other components. I think Southern Europe is now the Iberian Peninsula and Italy, Greece, and done some other changes. And then in the bottom left-hand corner, one of the big significant changes that we made was that Western Africa, that was traditionally one global region, is now 6 additional regions within Western Africa. And so this just really shows that we're going to continue, as we get more data and continue to study the genetics, be able to sort of break down further these ethnic regions. And
hey, Ken?
yes.
Ken, if you could speak a little louder, some
Okay.
people are having trouble hearing you.
No problem. Let me know. So this is the sort of a screenshot of the beta ethnicity results, and to be completely honest, we launched this sort of more quickly. We knew we needed to get some actual information from customers, and so this version looked like this. And a couple things we did wrong. We immediately realized that having a pie chart in a number like 23% without any sense that 23% could vary was really just a mistake. I mean, we really from the beginning should have thought about creating some kind of range to communicate to customers that it wasn't as concrete as the numbers and this website sort of suggested. The other thing that we did is we put current political borders, which again, in retrospect, we kind of knew it wasn't perfect, but to be honest, we didn't know what else to do. And that certainly caused some concern among customers, because the current political borders really don't represent the true migration and genetics that we see. The third thing that we probably caused the single most angst was this concept of uncertainty. And what was interesting about that is that we did it because of really scientific integrity, in the sense that there's some regions that we just felt we didn't have enough data to really present to anyone what that would be. And so we said, why don't we just put those regions in an uncertainty bucket and not try to give someone results that we may have to really alter later. It turned out to cause tremendous amounts of angst amongst our customers. And I think the one thing we did do well is people do understand the concept of ethnicity and genetic ethnicity. We've done a bunch of surveys to make sure that people understand the two, that we're not, just because we present a certain genetic ethnicity, it's not that in any way we're trying to take away your culture and how you were brought up and how you perceive yourself from an ethnic standpoint. And I think I've been pleased that people haven't sort of confounded or conflated those two issues, and they do keep them very separate in their minds. But, so going now, this is just the scientific graph. Science, not a scientist, I think the one thing to keep in mind, the only thing I want to point out here is this is a way to represent genetic information. And if you take a country like England and you take people that have all 4 grandparents that were born in England, and you do your genetics, the point I want to make is you can see from the blue, the sort of yellow, greenish, and red, is that the varying populations that we see genetically in someone that has all 4 grandparents from England is really, really diverse. And so that what our concept of what being English is from sort of a cultural standpoint and what it means to be English genetically is very different. And so we struggled with this concept. And when we do, this is, again, a lot of data, but the whole point is that we've done a lot of work to look at every single population and look at the breadth of, when we say you're English, what does that actually mean genetically, and what are the ranges that we see. And I would say the area of Central Europe and England, not surprisingly, the British Isles, not surprisingly, is actually one of the most challenging ones that we have. And here's an example of where you look at all the populations that we're testing on the x-axis, and the range that we see for people that have all 4 grandparents from the same region.
And in some instances, this is here's Anglo-Saxon. And what you see is if you're, Anglo-Saxon or English, I mean, the mean or the median in this case is like, 65% of the times we get, if you're 100%, let me back up. If you have all four grandparents from the same region, we would call you about 65% Anglo-Saxon or English. But the range is anywhere between 20% and 90%. So we see a huge variability. And then if you're not Anglo-Saxon or English, then the second most likely population that we call you is Western Europe. And so here's the big range there. You see that if you're not one, then maybe you're the other. And then of course we have outliers. This is science. This is this is the reality of the statistics, that sometimes people are just outliers in the set. So I would argue that this is very similar to giving someone results for a predisposition to a certain disease, where yes, in aggregate or the population data would suggest that that's the percentage or statistics or probability, but in reality the individual's results may actually be very varying. And so this is, to us, very analogous to that. And then, and I'll show in a second how we sort of dealt with that. On uncertainty, I mean, there was just really a lot of interesting comments. Was disappointed with the uncertainty. It probably covers my Native American, which goes into sort of biases that people come in with. I don't know about the uncertain. I mean, I can just give you literally, sheets and sheets of people really having, concerned about the uncertainty bucket and wanting to know what was in there, and in many cases feeling like we were hiding something from them when in fact we were trying to do no such thing. And so I think the one thing that we really have had to focus on is the fact that people have biases and filters that they come in with. And this is just one that I got off the internet, which I find very interesting. A person took their results from us, didn't like the uncertainty bucket, put it into one of these programs that Jen was talking about, where you can go take your data, raw data download, and put it in another site. This one actually gave more, I don't want to say more accurate, certainly broke it down and gave some percentages that are lower than what we gave on the beta. And he posts that, as you can see, this algorithm versus the one from Ancestry DNA picks up the Native American that I knew I had, right? And so what's interesting is you're looking at something that's less than 1%, and in no way am I suggesting that he's not right about his genealogy. All I'm saying is it gets really difficult, right, when you get to these low percentages to basically any certain amount of confidence, and you have to deal with the bias if a person sees it or not. So this to me was one of those just interesting cases, and you can see there's a bunch of other low percentages that he makes no mention of having any documented records for. So on the next version, we did a lot of context, a lot of educational and material, and really try to be as transparent as possible to make sure that we gave the community, scientific and genealogical community, the confidence that we're really working hard at providing the most accurate information that we could. And the first thing we did was really a lot of historical context. I mean, you almost have to view genetic data with, within the context of migrations over time. I mean, you think of, like, I even used the word Anglo-Saxon earlier, but there really were Germanic tribes, right? And so when you look at that, you start realizing why the British Isles look the way it is. But unless we communicate that to customers, they're very confused and don't know how to understand the results. And so again, more contextual information. We did some surveys on it. Overwhelmingly, people said they loved it, they referred to it, they thought it helped make the results more clear to them and made a lot more sense. So we were really happy with that. So historical context in terms of ancestry, I think, was something that was really important. And here's just one last one that we had from the Norman. The second thing is communicating geography. We said from the beginning, using the current political borders didn't make a lot of sense. And so this is just one scientific representation that I won't get into, but basically these, again, are people that have, grandparents from, let's say, the British Isles, and you can see that genetically they're spread throughout Western Europe, obviously part of Scandinavia, etc. And so what we've done in the new representation of the map is, rather than show Great Britain as just over the current political border, what we're doing is we're showing these sort of concentric circles or heat map kind of thing to really show to people that having this genetic ethnicity may go well beyond the border that you think that, the border, not only that you think, the borders that your genealogical records might point to, right? Because those people may have migrated and stuff like that. So here's just some of the other ones that we have, and all of them are very much this way. And this, again, has actually helped dramatically to give customers a sense of what it means to be of a certain ethnic group, that there really has been migration and a lot more spread than one normally would think about. The other thing we did was communicate ranges. So we completely abandoned the pie chart and the certainty that we were giving in terms of the numbers. And what you can see is we did a couple things. One, we nested certain things. So rather than creating an uncertainty bucket, what we did is we highlighted the ones that we had the most confidence in, and then created something that we call trace regions. And if you click on that trace regions, it will actually give you some of the lower ones. And we warn people that we're not that confident. And as you can see here in the middle box, for Eastern Europe, this gives you a sense. If we say you're 71, we're actually looking at somewhere between 61 and 82. We do something called the bootstrap, where we run your genetic ethnicity 40 times, and we remove parts of your genome every time to give us this sort of range and confidence level. But again, now it's not 71; it's a range. And then on the on the far right, you see Native American, which is one that people really take the test to find out, confirm or deny something that they've heard in the lore. We say we have less than 1%, but we were honest about the fact that it could very well be zero. So this is how we're trying to really communicate to people. And again, the comments that we're getting back have been sort of very positive about the ranges. And then just I'll breeze through super quickly. We give you other things to give you context. So here's how this individual, their genetic percentages relate to someone who's a typical person that's a native in that country. We say if you're not, here's what a typical native look like. If you're not from this region, what else would you be? And on. And again, don't have enough time, but if you take the test or go through it and download some of the white papers that we have, you'll see what we did here to try to give people some sense of that. And then a lot of tiered educational material. So basically, from the very beginning, you get some information, and you can dig in as deeply as you want to understand down to the actual science that was used to calculate that percentage is all on the website and available to any of the customers. So here's the transparency. We actually, I mentioned a second ago, the bootstrapping. We go through great lengths to explain what we did and why their ranges and why we, what is it that we're actually presenting in terms of confidence intervals. The white paper I mentioned, I think, is 40 pages, and it contains all of the statistics, all of the genetics, all of the raw data that was used to calculate that, including all the population references that were used to calculate that. So you can just see here some of that information. And again, you can tell from this last one, it's kind of funny, right? We put all the math in there, and most people don't understand it, but they feel good that we're willing to actually share it. And that's given people a lot of confidence in our results. So this has actually been a great success as well. And I think I've got just one or two more slides on the data download is a big issue, and it's something we really need to keep in mind as you're thinking about privacy, because people really feel a right to their data, and we make it available to them. But once it's in their hands, it's out of our custodial responsibility, right? There's nothing we can really do. So people do download this data to sites that, frankly, I'm not sure how secure they are. I'm not sure how they store their data, but there it is. You can do a data download. We ask you to re-enter your password, then we send you an email. So we do, when it's within, again, within the walls of Ancestry, we go a long way to making sure that only the person that the data belongs to actually can download the data. And we have this double authentication and all sorts of other things. This link that you get actually expires after a certain amount of time. But again, the big privacy concern that we have to think about is what happens once it leaves the companies, because I think once that data is out there, the customers are doing a lot of interesting things with those data. And I mentioned the questionnaire. I'm not quite ready to share any of the results, but we are going to publish a bunch of the information that we gather. So we did a survey before and after the new ethnicity launch, and spent a lot of time asking questions regarding education, regarding the transparency, regarding, do you understand what these results mean? How surprised would you be if tomorrow they changed your major ethnicity, let's say, changed by 5%, by 10%, by 50%, just to get a range of where people felt that the accuracy of those results were. So pretty interesting, and we hope to be publishing these soon. and these are just some of the questions that are there, and you guys can look at it. So in the future, look, the only thing I want to say here in closing, as we talk, as it relates to whole genome sequencing, is there's no question that the price has been dropping dramatically. We're currently using a chip that has 700,000 SNPs, but there, I think, no question whatsoever that the field is going to move to sequencing and eventually whole genome sequencing. And then in a site like Ancestry, you might be able to take a test and download your entire whole genome sequence from the web. And I think we need to sort of consider uh, what implications that has. And in my own gut is that I think customers really want the data, and it's going to be impossible for them, for us to keep the data from them. But I think what we really need to do, and some of our work demonstrates, is if we really educate consumers about not only what to do with the data, but potentially how to protect themselves, I think it'll go a long way. I think people are really open to that, and they're eager to learn. But it'll be an interesting challenge going forward. So I just want to super quickly thank my team and the advisory board. We really do have, I think, 10 PhDs in the team now that have been working on this, and it's going to be fun to see how this field evolves. So, Sharon, I'll leave it there.
Yes, terrific, excellent, thank you. It made me want to just switch screens and go to my DNA results in Ancestry.com and play with them again. Okay, so questions. We have several, and a reminder that you can put questions in the question box on your panel. You find it by going to the GoToWebinar control panel, and there's a little section that says questions, so feel free to type your questions in there. We do have a couple of questions in there already, but before I go to those, I want to see, was there anything that either of you wanted to comment or ask the other?
I'm okay.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer questions that the other the webinar attendees have.
Okay, great. So the first one is for you to comment on whether, Jen, you've seen examples of good state policies that address ancestry and privacy confidentiality rights, and Ken, whether those were part of your considerations as you develop and certainly as you move forward. Some of those things change in time, and you want to be able to adapt to them. So if both of you could comment on essentially privacy confidentiality on the state level, since those policies are often on the state level.
Yeah, I mean, actually, a lot of what I've seen is relating to the new laws that are proposed laws that are popping up in terms of genetic rights and protecting it in the guise of property rights. So, there was a proposed law in Massachusetts, a proposed law in Vermont, and South Dakota, and Alabama, and we're seeing them pop up in a number of states, and they really are trying to focus in on the source of the information, so providing the property rights to the individual of the person from whom it was derived or who provided the sample, not necessarily who the information might pertain to, since that might pertain to multiple individuals. So that's one aspect. I mean, I think that at least I'm a proponent of generally applicable laws and not having to have a specific law dealing with DNA information, because we have been grappling with these issues for some time with other sources of information. So some of the states are closed and don't provide access to, for example, birth records, and that's been an issue in terms of the push between recognizing privacy of the individuals, who the parents and the family members of the biological parents, to keep that information private, versus interest, say, to access that information from an adopted individual, right? So there's quite variability from state to state on that issue, and I don't think that genetic information or genomic information necessarily warrants having a special law, as so much as it does recognizing that we have these other areas to protect that information and the integrity of the individual.
Yeah, so what I will add is that we, in our terms and conditions, actually give ownership of the data and the sample to the customer. So I think we're the only ones to have done that, but I felt like it was the right thing to do. We did look at a bunch of the state laws. I don't know how much they influenced us on it, but we did give that right. There is an informed consent that is an opt-in informed consent at Ancestry. If at any point people want to have their data deleted or their sample destroyed, we absolutely give them that right. So we have felt that, we've taken the position that the customer owns the data, that the customer owns the sample. We just retain a right to do research on it to the extent that they continue to grant us that right.
Can I ask you a question? Can you talk a little bit about how, just for people who might not know about your site, how you link the genetic information to a family tree itself, and what happens if that tree is public versus private, or how those settings work?
Yeah, sure. So basically, when you log in, when you purchase the test, we ask you if you have a tree on Ancestry. If you do, we ask you who in that tree the DNA belongs to, because a lot of times it's really families that sort of participate in this, and then it's linked to that tree, or to that individual, and then from that point on, even if the tree is public, we always have some securities. If you're a living individual, we never show living individuals even on public trees. And the second thing is the DNA information is not shown whatsoever. So that actually remains completely segregated. If even if let's say you and I ended up being cousins and we matched, if you used an alias, I wouldn't know who you are, and then I could send you a message through our anonymous exchange. If you choose then at that point to identify yourself, share your tree, share your identity, you can do that. But everything is actually kept confidential, and the identity is not disclosed unless you want to be disclosed.
Great. Okay, what do you both think about the blurring of the line that is used to separate medical and non-medical genetic information?
What do we think about the blurring line? Is that what
the blurring of the line, so that there used to be, or at least attempt to be, some crisp line between what is medical and what is non-medical, and now that line sometimes is fairly blurry. What do you each think about that?
I can jump in quick. So I think that information is handled contextually, and so I don't see necessarily the medicalization of the genome as being a good thing. Genetic information isn't necessarily medical at all, and I think that just like Ken was talking about the expectations that individuals have when they come to direct consumer, those are very different expectations than what one has when someone goes to a primary care physician, for example, and asks for information. I mean, the motivations are quite different, and what they expect to have returned to them is quite different, notwithstanding the potential uses that they might have down the road for that information. So from a at-home setting to a research laboratory setting to a medical office setting, I think that the lines aren't necessarily all that blurred anymore if we think about the way we've provided oversight and have tried to protect the legitimacy and the validity and reliability of all of the information that we get, right? I mean, we have the medical profession is highly regulated. We have, state licensing of a national licensing of medical providers, and all sorts of rules that govern that context, yet we don't require the same kind of regulations and oversight, for example, of a high school health teacher who tells students, look, if you eat a lot of sugar and fats and salts, that might be bad for your weight, that might have health implications, here are things you can do to change that. So I think a lot of times we get caught up in this world where we have very scholarly discussions that aren't necessarily in line with what's happening in the real world. And I think that the context of information, both in terms of how we access it and receive it, but also how we use it, is really still the key.
Yeah, super quickly, I would say that in some ways I can certainly see the thought that, as we get more and more information, genetic information, that there's a sort of a blurring of the lines. And in some ways, to be honest, I mean, when we do our predictions. We don't look at medical traits, but I mean, they're in many ways they're one and the same, right? So then the question um, becomes, you know, is that any different than what we've known? I would argue that family medical history is something that, you know, absent, you know, any genetic test, you would still know if something runs in your family, and if you have several you know, relatives that are affected, there's a good chance that you think that you were also affected. So I don't know that anything really changes that much, but I think what's happening is things are accelerating. Things are accelerating, and I don't know. It's not a great answer. I don't know what to do. It does feel like as everyone is going to have their whole genome in their, you know, access to their entire genome, I think there is going to be a lot more information. And I would argue just for more education so that people understand what to do and not to do with that data is really where we need to go rather than restrict it. I think it's going to be very difficult to restrict it personally.
Okay, and we are at the end of our time. One last really quick question. Can you remind us the percentage that we're all related to Genghis Khan?
I get asked that a lot, and I'm going to have to look that up so I have an answer.
Yeah, right. And now you'll be able to tell whether or not those estimates have actually been true all these years.
I will say we will eventually release some stuff. There were some very you know, as we say in genetics, very fit genes and very fit people early in our history that were very successful at mating and producing offspring, and they actually potentially have generated a lot of the people living today here in the U.S., and that'll be fun to see.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you both. To remind our listeners, this will be edited, and certainly not at all edited for content, but just for us to tidy up the beginning and end, and placed on our website at geneticalliance.org/events/webinars. We are very, very grateful to Ken and Jen both for being with us today and for sharing their thoughts. And everyone have a good day. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.